The most common symptom of a broken TorqueMaster spring is that the door opens a few inches and then stops. When a spring breaks, the door is heavy, and the opener can't lift the door. By closing the door, disengaging it from the opener, and lifting with a scale, the door weight will usually be over 50 pounds. On single car doors with one spring broken, or on double car doors with two broken springs, the first noticeable symptom might be loose cables at each end of the door. If you see this, do not attempt to open your door as you may damage it or possibly injure yourself. A third symptom of a broken TorqueMaster spring is that the door will not close all the way. This is because the opener sometimes lifts a door with a broken spring and loose cables. And when the opener closes the door, it won't close all the way because the cables are tangled. To replace TorqueMaster springs, we recommend the following tools: a drill with impact function, a 7/16" nut driver or socket with adapter for the drill, and two 7/16" wrenches, two vice grips, a tape measure, flat tip screwdrivers, a Phillips screwdriver with a number 2 tip, and needle nose pliers. You'll also need oil. An impact wrench would be helpful. You may also need some tape, a small punch, a knife, a hammer, and a few 16-penny nails. For safety, close the door, unplug your opener, and then detach the opener drawbar arm. If you have a single car door with only one spring that is broken, both cables should be loose. If you have a double car door, you will have two springs inside the torque tube. If both your cables are loose, it is safe to assume that both springs are broken. If your door is heavy, if you've determined you have a broken spring, and if both cables are tight, this should indicate that one of the two springs is broken. This is the most common situation that occurs. Here we begin. Position your ladder on the right side and loosen the lock nut on the winder counterclockwise 1/4 turn. Next, using a drill with a 7/16" nut driver or socket, turn the 7/16" bolt head counterclockwise until the 0 on the counter wheel lines up with a mark on the winder bracket. If both cables are tight when the counter wheel reaches 0, the spring is broken on this side, and you have been turning the end of a broken spring. If both cables come loose when the counter wheel reaches 0, the spring on this side was not broken and you just unwound it. Move your ladder to the left side. If both cables are tight, it would normally be because you have two springs, and the spring on this side is still wound. You will need to unwind it. Repeat the procedure you followed on the opposite side. Loosen the lock nut a 1/4 turn, and unwind the spring by turning the bolt head counterclockwise until the counter wheel reaches 0. Both cables should now be loose. If not, add or subtract tension on each side until the cables loosen. If both cables are loose, and if you have a counter gear and wheel on this side, remove them at this time. Use a flat tip screwdriver to pry them off the winder. Be careful not to damage these as they are no longer in production by Wayne Dalton. If they are damaged, you'll see later in this video a different way to count the number of turns when winding the spring. On a single spring door, this end of the assembly will not have a counter gear and wheel. For safety, vice grip the winder as shown. Continue gripping the winder, and use a drill, ratchet wrench, or an impact wrench with a 7/16" nut driver or socket to remove the two lag screws that secure the winding bracket to the header. Remove the Phillips head screw. If needed, push it out with a nail or punch. On many doors, this screw is not installed, and the door worked fine without it. This screw is usually not needed except on heavier doors. Carefully pry the winder bracket and gear off the winding cone. At this point, the spring may unwind. Remove the winding gear if present, and remove the cable drum. You may need to tap it gently with a hammer. Let the drum hang over the horizontal track ankle. If there is a spring on this side, and if it is broken, you will be able to pull part of the spring out of the end of the tube. However, at this time you need to put the spring back in the tube and reseat the winder cone in the top of the flag angle as shown. This will make bringing the spring down from the header easier in the following steps. If the spring on this side is broken next to the cone, or if there is no spring to support this side, you may want to support the end of the tube with a 16-penny nail. Move your ladder to the right side and repeat the same steps. Remove the counter wheel and counter gear. For safety, vice grip the winder bracket and remove the 2 lag screws that secure the bracket to the jamb. Remove the Phillips screw if present. Carefully remove the winding gear and housing. Remove the cable drum and hang it over the track angle. Pull on the winder cone to see if you can remove it. This will indicate whether the spring on this side is broken. Reseat the winder cone in the top of the flag angle. If the spring on this side is broken next to the cone, you may want to support the end of the tube with a 16-penny nail. Move the ladder to the center. Remove the 2 lag screws that secure the center support bracket to the header. If you have an iDrive opener, unplug the unit, remove the wires and disconnect cable, and remove the 2 screws under the motor. To safely lower the tube to the floor, first determine the balance center of the tube and center your ladder under it. To do this, lift the tube in the middle and see which end separates from the flag angle first. If the right side rises first, move your ladder to the left a foot and see which end separates from the flag angle first. Repeat this process until you find the center and position your ladder under it. Lift the shaft above the support at each end. Avoid letting the shaft tilt, as the springs may slide inside the tube, changing the balance center. This could cause one end to drop, possibly damaging the door or other items in the garage. Carefully lower the torsion tube to the floor, or to evenly space sawhorses to support the tube. If you have only one spring on your door, it will be on the right side. Pull out the broken piece. There may be a rod inside the spring sticking out the end of the tube. Raise the right end and see if the spring slides out of the left end of the tube. If the spring will not slide, reinstall the spring and rod if there is one, and knock the spring loose with a hammer. For safety, and to avoid damaging the end of the tube, secure a 1/2-inch deep well socket or similar tool with a vice grip, and knock the spring loose. You may need to butt the left end of the tube against the garage footing or jamb. Once the spring is loose, slide it out of the left end of the tube. Next, remove the liner from the right end of the tube. If you can't remove the liner, one option is to reverse the ends of the tube and install the spring in the other end. If you have 2 springs, and if both are broken, remove the ends of the broken springs. Remove the liners, and remove the springs inside the tube as demonstrated in select segments of the following video. If you have 2 springs, and if only one is broken, go to the end with the broken spring and remove the end of the spring. If there is a 3/8-inch spacer rod, remove that as well. Next, remove the liner. The easiest way to remove the liner is with needle nose pliers, but you may need to first separate the liner from the inside of the tube with a knife, awl, or thin flat screwdriver. Next, grip the end of the liner with needle nose pliers. If you can't pull the liner out of the tube, rotate the pliers 1 or 2 turns. This will strengthen the grip of the pliers, and it will also separate the ends of the liner that have been glued with dried oil. If the liner still will not slide out, slide a hacksaw blade around the end of the liner to break the bond. If all else fails, melt the end of the liner with a lighter. Do not use a torch, as this may damage the tube. Finally, pull out the liner until it is completely out of the tube. To remove the rest of the spring, go to the opposite end of the tube, grip the winding cone, and lift that end to see if the rest of the spring slides out the other end. If it doesn't, remove the vice grip from the unbroken spring so that it can slide through the tube and knock the broken spring loose from the tube. If the unbroken spring doesn't slide, lower the tube to your sawhorses or to the floor and knock the spring loose with your hammer and a socket punch, or a socket extension. You may need to butt the opposite end of the tube against the garage footer or jamb. Some cones are lodged so securely that they require repeated pounding even with a 20-ounce hammer. If this is the case, be careful not to damage the end of the tube. After loosening the unbroken spring, raise this end of the tube again, and allow the spring to slide down the inside of the tube to knock the other spring loose. Repeat this process several times if needed. If the inside end of the spring doesn't come loose, reinstall the broken end of the spring and the 3/8 inch metal spacer if present. Knock the spring loose with your hammer and a punch, or a socket extension as you may have done on the other end. Lift the right end of the tube and shake the tube horizontally. Both springs should now slide out the left end. The next step is to remove the other liner, following the same steps demonstrated earlier. Look inside the shaft to assure the liners and all other parts have been removed. Check to make sure the cones on the new springs are compatible with your winding units. Also check to make sure you install the springs on the correct ends. The right wind spring is installed on the right side as you look at the door from inside the garage. If you have two springs, the left wind is installed on the left side. Check the engraved designations, left and right, on the winding cones to confirm you are installing the springs on the correct ends. Align the teardrop-shaped stationary cone and liner with the end and slide the cone, liner, and spring into the tube. It's a good practice to extend a 1/4 inch of liner beyond the end of the tube to make the next spring replacement easier. If you have steel winding cones, vice grip both to prevent the springs from sliding into the tube when you reinstall the shaft. If you have plastic cones, it is better to tape the ends to avoid the possibility of breaking the cones. If you have only one spring, the left end will be supported with just a winding cone inserted in the cable drum. Center your ladder next to the door. Find the balance point of the shaft. Keep the shaft as level as possible and lift it into place with both ends above the horizontal track angles as they were before removing the center bracket. Secure the center support bracket to the header, or if there is an iDrive opener, secure that. Move your ladder to the left side of the door and remove the vice grip if you used one on this end. Align the winding cone to the top of the flag angle. At this time you will reinstall the cable drums and winding units, but first, oil the bearings inside each drum. A 40-weight oil is recommended, but any motor oil or 3-in-1 oil will work. Oil the left side, and then move your ladder to the right side of the door and oil the right bearing. If you are replacing your cables, view our instructions on our website. Next, remove the vice grip from the cone. Position the recessed groove of the cone in the top curve of the flag angle. If you supported that end of the tube with a nail, grip the nail with vice grip and remove the nail with a hammer claw. Before installing the cable drums, set a vice grip so that it will cling to the cable, but do not grip the cable at this time. Measure and mark 3 inches below the bottom of the flag angle. Notice the recessed groove between the splines and the end of the spring. Slide the drum over the cone until you see this groove again. Position the recessed groove of the cone on top of the curved portion of the flag angle. Align the cables in the grooves of the drum and turn the shaft until the cable on the drum is tight. Hang the vice grip on the cable just even with the bottom of the flag angle, and turn the shaft until the vice grip drops to the 3-inch mark. Vice grip the tube so the other grip cannot drop below the 3-inch mark. Notice how the winding gear and worm gear meet in the winding unit. Slide the winding gear onto the cone and lubricate the gear. Any motor oil or 3-in-1 oil should be fine. Install the winder so that the worm gear aligns properly with the winding gear. Turn the bolt head as needed to align the gears. Secure the winding bracket to the header with the two 5/16" lag screws and the small Phillips head screw which you removed earlier. Notice how the missing teeth on the counter gear align with the guides in the counter wheel. Slide the counter gear and counter wheel onto the winding bracket. As you do this, the 0 on the wheel should line up with the mark on the winder. Move your ladder to the left side. If you have a single spring system, and if there is no spring on this end, slide the winding cone through the cable drum. While gripping the outer end of the winding cone, rotate the drum and wrap the cable onto it. Next, slide the drum over the end of the TorqueMaster tube and rest the cone on the top of the flag angle. If you have a 2-spring system with a spring on this end, wrap the cable around the drum and then slide the drum over the winding cone and onto the tube. Install the winding cone on top of the flag angle. Notice how the vice grip at the other end of the tube is pointed down. The weight of the grip helps keep the cable tight on both ends. Install the winding gear and lubricate the gear. Install and secure the winder and install the counter mechanism. Check to assure the cables run free of obstructions from the drum to the bottom fixture, and check to see that the top of the cable is properly seated in the grooves of the drum. Examine the chart to determine the number of turns to wind the spring. This door is 7 feet tall, so if there are 2 springs, we will wind both 16 complete turns. Use a drill and wind the spring clockwise with a 7/16" nut driver or socket. Use the counter wheel to count the number of turns on the spring. Even if your door has unmatched springs, you still wind them the same number of turns. Check the winding mechanism to be sure the washer is included. This prevents the winding bolt from binding as you wind the spring. If the counter mechanism does not work, you can roll paper into the end of the winding cone and count turns as the paper rotates. Notice as you wind the spring that the drum takes up the extra cable we had on the right side. Also, as you wind the spring, check to assure that the cable is wrapped properly in the grooves of the cable drum. Go to the right side and remove the vice grip from the right cable and grip the track about 3 inches above the center roller. This will prevent an accident in case you wind the spring too many turns, or if the springs you ordered are too strong for your door. Before winding the right spring, make sure both cables are free and not wrapped around a roller or jam bracket. Use a drill and wind the bolt on the right side clockwise with a 7/16" nut driver or socket. Watch the counter wheel and stop winding when you reach the number of turns needed. You're nearly finished. Remove the vice grip from the right track. The door should remain on the floor by itself. It should stay when raised halfway, and it should stay when fully open. Adjust the springs as needed to improve the balance. If your door is heavy and if it won't stay open, add up to 2 turns to improve the balance. If the door won't stay on the floor, the springs may be too strong. Remove up to 2 turns to improve the balance. Remember that on a 7-foot high door, you normally wind the springs 16 turns. Do not wind more than 18 turns or fewer than 14 turns. On a 7-foot high door, if your springs are too strong at 14 turns, or if they are too weak at 18 turns, you may need to order a new spring or springs. Stand back and look at the door with it closed. Check the seal on the bottom. If the bottom of the door is up on one side, the cable on this side will be shorter and you will need to lengthen it. To do this, grip the end of the cable next to the drum and loosen the drum set screws as needed until the bottom of the door seals evenly on both sides. Tighten the set screw and remove the vice grip. Open and close the door again to assure you have the correct seal on the bottom of the door. The final step is to tighten the lock nuts on each winder a quarter turn. You are now finished. You can attach the opener arm, plug in the opener, and test the door with the opener. Congratulations on a job well done.